I'm John Byrne with AML Right Source. And today we have with us Steve Lamb. Steve is the Chief Operating Officer at a company called Kyckr that works with business verification, a whole host of other things, which we're going to talk to Steve about. They're in and have clients in over 100 countries. So given the fact that we've been dealing with the challenge in the States and globally on beneficial ownership, something that FATF has weighed in on, we thought it would be appropriate to talk to an expert where he sees what's happening throughout the world, and, and some of the value of making sure we do proper verification. So Steve, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time today. And let's just jump right into it. Give us a sense of why it's so important. It's always important to know who you're doing business with, right? But verification, given data, bad data, good data, that sort of thing. Talk a bit about the verification world and part of what you guys are doing, but also what you see are some of the challenges.
Absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here. And as you said, it is a really important topic. What we're considering verification, you need to know who you're doing business with, in every walk of life, whether that's with another individual or with a business counterparty. And, one of the starting points for the problem that Kyckr tries to solve is there is just so much data out there now. There is new data being created all the time. You go on the web, increasingly with LLMs as well, it's very hard to know what's misinformation, disinformation, real. So trying to coalesce all of that into a real, truthful view of the counterparty can be very difficult, and actually getting that data in a usable format. And if we zoom in more into the financial crime and AML space, well, why is verification important there? Well, it's a legal requirement. So you've got the FATF recommendations stating that every time you, as a regulated entity, do business with a customer, you need to make sure you're verifying their identity using reliable and independent data. And really, why Kyckr was set up, and a big part of my role, is that reliability piece. So how do we ensure that the data that is being used to do that verification is trusted, is audit-proof, is something that you can point to and be confident in, and ultimately you're not going to be defrauded. And I think the challenges that we see really relate to the global data ecosystem and what exists online and in corporate registries locally. And if you take the average corporate registry, they are an incredibly important part of government, but typically quite a small, an underfunded, part of the government, but with an outsized importance and role. And all corporate registries have some similarities, but they tend to work in different ways. There's different access protocols for how you can get hold of the information. There's different data itself that's available. So trying to make sense of that world and bring some normalization and some consistency into that data is really where we sit. And I think one of the core challenges that exists, not only in beneficial ownership, as I'm sure we'll talk about, but in every kind of business verification.
So going back to FATF, and I pulled up the brief description of Recommendation 24, and as we both know, and people that are watching and listening to this clearly understand the importance of beneficial ownership information. And in the U.S., just as a quick side note, we've talked about this offline. U.S. was criticized, I believe correctly, back in 2006, that they didn't have the proper laws and regs in place, and they're finally getting there, and we're in 2025. So it's been an interesting time. The U.S. in some cases leads the way with AML-related things, but in this one, it wasn't the case. But anyway, going back to recommendation, FATF says this is on their site. They said they agreed that tougher global beneficial ownership rules to stop criminals from hiding their illicit activities behind secret corporate structures. So to your point, it's all about transparency. They said this will close loopholes and regulatory weaknesses that they opine for too long have allowed fake companies to be used as a cover for criminal activity or to hide wealth from tax authorities. So both of those things are obviously important. So give us a sense of the global, I know there's so much going on, but the global landscape. What are some of the things that are working well from your perspective? Where are some of the challenges? I know you want to mention a couple of particular jurisdictions, Singapore being one and the UK another, and I want to ask you some follow-ups on that. We want to talk about access, but given where you sit, I mean, you're in a perfect position to see this vast global landscape. What are you seeing? You know, are we in the middle of improvement? Are we at the beginning? Those sorts of things.
It's always
I think it would be fair to describe it as a mixed bag globally. So you've got the FATF recommendation that is very, very clear. In fact, it strongly recommends the introduction of central UBO registries for countries. In terms of the adoption of that, though globally, you know, as with everything, you've got you know, some very good performers and early adopters, and then you've got some laggards and some very, you know, noticeably poor performers. I'm going to do something probably very unfashionable in the moment in this part of the world. I'm going to defend the US actually and say that, you know, yes, you know, it's not certainly not the first country to introduce a beneficial ownership registry, but by no means the last.
Right.
You look at, you know, Australia, New Zealand, neither country's got beneficial ownership registries. We would consider them typically quite transparent from a corporate transparency standpoint. We take the UK, there has been a UBO registry, or as we call it, the Persons of Significant Control registry in the UK for a number of years. But actually, the data quality is very, very questionable. Really? And it comes back to your point about you know, the mechanisms that criminals use to hide illicit finance and illicit gains, and actually they are exploiting the differences between different systems and different jurisdictions and the weaknesses in those registration controls. So, you know, criminals thrive in the dark. What they want is a system where they can build complex structures, and those are not accessible and visible to the public, to financial institutions, to journalists. You know, and it's very easy to do that where it's, you know, impossible to see the ownership of a company, whether that's intermediate ownership or ultimate ownership. I think a really interesting, actually, kind of microcosm for the debate globally between privacy on the one hand, personal privacy and ownership transparency, is probably the EU, where actually the EU, as it so often is in financial crime terms, was kind of a bastion for early adoption and good practice when it came to UBO registries. So you had the fourth anti-money laundering directive a number of years ago mandating the introduction of beneficial ownership registries for all of the member states. Yeah. And you had the fifth AMLD, which mandated that they be public beneficial ownership registries. So we had a kind of golden period for a couple of years. This was about 2020 to 2022, where, you know, you could go to most European registries, at least those that had introduced it at that time, and request a report on a company, see who their UBOs were. And then what happened is November 22 came along, and there was a court case at the CJEU by a Luxembourgish UBO and a company that said, look, you know, this right to access this information that currently exists is fundamentally incompatible with my rights as a European citizen to privacy of my data. And, you know, again, anyone that knows anything about EU politics or culture will know that question of data privacy is just fundamental to how a lot of legislation is written. Sure. So they ruled in their favour. Overnight access was switched off. Made for a very interesting 24 hours for Kyckr and for lots of our clients when suddenly you've got this vast swathe of information that was being relied upon no longer available. And really since then, I mean, there has been a reintroduction of legitimate interest access. So lots of the organisations that we all both know, and many of your listeners will now be able to get access to that information if they can prove the legitimacy of their need, and, you know, them being regulated. But we're nowhere near where we were before. And actually, even within that, there are many differences in how that information can be accessed, and restrictions on, you know, what I would probably say are relatively legitimate forms of interest, such as, for example, journalists, investigators looking into corporate ownership structures. So it's a real mixed bag.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about this before. Groups like ICIJ and OCCRP, they do tremendous amount of work shining a light on oligarchs, transnational criminal organizations, terror financing opportunities, drug cartels, and if they don't have that access, that becomes problematic. Can you, briefly sort of describe what is the access rules at the EU? You alluded to it. So if I'm a journalist or an academic, what are the categories besides the regulated that obviously need that information to do their proper due diligence? Could you walk us through that a little bit? I know in the States, by the way, whenever we finalize this, there's going to be not broad access at all from at least how it sits now. I mean, that could change. And then we have both seen, and our community has seen, great investigative pieces that wouldn't have happened if journalists weren't able to figure out who was behind the ownership of some of these companies. That's clear, and unfortunately, the way the world is going seems to be against that sort of transparency. Anyway, long-winded way of saying, give us a sense of some of the access issues in the EU and other places, and how you see that.
Yeah, it really depends on the country, is the first thing to say. So there are some where, a journalistic interest is considered legitimate. There are some where noticeably it isn't. So Ireland would be a good example, otherwise quite a transparent, open corporate registry. The real problem, as I've said around some of the other issues, is around standardization. So, there are some registries where if you're sat there as a bank, you're an AML analyst, and you have a customer you need to verify, there's quite a complex set of forms and justification and evidencing you would need to go through to access that report. There's others that it's a lot easier. So I think this is potentially going to change now. So there was an amendment to the 6 AMLD. We love the AMLDs earlier this year, which proposed standardizing some of those access formats, and even some quite lofty goals around standardization of the data, potentially API access. But I think we're quite a long way off that. And yeah, I would completely reiterate what you said, that my position, both as a personal citizen and working for Kyckr, is there is huge evidence of the benefit that well-trained journalists with a clear purpose to what they're doing have rooted out, large criminal behaviour. You look at things like the Panama Papers back in 2016 or whatever it was, and it's happening to this day as well with some of the more open registers. I know very well a chap called Graham Barrow, who I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with, who's a UK chap who's very, very central to the debate around Companies House and accessing information and some of the issues there. There's another guy called Dan Needle in the UK as well, who's a tax lawyer by trade, who's recently published some investigations that look at just how much some of the UK's registration rules are being exploited. Right. And look, you can only do that with open data. So yeah, I do. I'm an optimistic person, and I'm generally optimistic about the transparency debate. But yeah, it's a fragile thing that needs to be preserved, I think.
We talked offline before we started about Singapore. I know you wanted to mention what's going on in that particular jurisdiction. And as I said up front, you folks are in 100 different countries, so there's obviously so much out there. But spend a little bit of time on that if you would.
So we've been doing an investigation recently on our own podcast, looking at the individual differences between corporate registries. So one of the topics has been UBO. Another one has been the extent to which registries conduct their own verification. So if we wanted to set up a limited company today, if we're in the UK, we could go to Companies House, pay the fee, set up the company. There is barely any verification. There's no verification that is done on that application. That is quite widespread in the world. There are many registries that exist as notice boards, if you like. You pay your fee, the company's created, they are there just to access the information. But on the other end of the spectrum, actually, there are a number increasingly that are particularly making good use of technology to try and root out suspicious or anomalous registrations at the point at which they're created. And clearly that's a good thing for the financial crime world, because it takes lots of the verification burden away from banks, law firms and other industries. So Singapore's a good example, because I think they have really lent into their role as an enforcer and a preventer when it comes to financial crime, and specifically using technology to assist with that. So they are now using AI to detect anomalous name registrations. So you would think, again, criminals can be pretty smart, that they would be able to come up with a reasonable company name for their fraudulent enterprise. But actually, when you look at it, quite often they're incorporating these businesses at scale, and they're random strings of letters and numbers. Right. Now, that's the type of thing that you can detect, not even with AI, with a statistical set of analysis. And that's before you get onto other factors or facets of that registration, where you can compare with other public or open data sets, not necessarily to tell you whether there's fraudulent intent, but at least raise a flag that there is something potentially suspicious there that needs to be investigated. So Singapore is doing that very well, and you know, there are other examples, Denmark being one where there's an increasing amount of verification being done. But again, it's the exception, not the norm. And that's really what we've been finding as we've been going through this series and investigating registries, is that by and large, and again, it's no criticism of the people working for these registries who you know, want to be doing more, but sadly often they don't have the legislative regulatory teeth to get stuck into these challenges, or they're chronically underfunded.
Yeah, I mean, that's you know, FATF can only do so much, and it's going to be really fascinating to see, and we've already started to see some of this, the mutual evaluations of countries and how the evaluators characterize the registry, the access, as you say, the verification and all of that. So it'll be interesting. But you're right, given given the scope, the global nature of this, it's like money laundering laws, pretty similar around the world, but obviously the priorities are different. You know, another quick aside, unfortunately from my perspective, just last week, the current Justice Department in the United States eliminated their kleptocracy task force. They had the DOJ had a kleptocracy task force, which they do asset forfeiture procedures, trying to get, you know, dollars back from oligarchs and others to victims. That's gone. So you know, these things unfortunately are so dependent upon leadership in these countries, and sadly, when that changes, sometimes the priorities change. I want to go back to some of the little bit in the weeds, but I think it's really important. Business verification. Obviously, that's what your company does, but also it's an important model the company should be taking advantage of. Talk a bit about that. Again, it's all about data. I'm curious how often you recommend verification, those sorts of things. Give us a sense of how you would approach a financial institution, a fintech company, whatever, and say, folks, in order to make sure your data is actually valid in terms of making sure you're detecting, preventing, and reporting possible suspicious activity, or making sure you're not onboarding companies that could be involved in illicit activity, what are some of the things that you walk people through?
It's always
So again, we talked about the FATF recommendation, you know, right, mandating that they use reliable and independent data. So let's just translate what that means. Well, firstly, whenever you onboard a new business as a customer, they're going to tell you a set of information about themselves. You know, this is our name, this is when we were founded, here are our directors, our UBOs. So the independence point is, well, you're going to need to seek out an additional data source that you can use to corroborate that information. And then, as I said before, that then needs to be reliable. So the first thing I would say is, and again, it goes back to the core of what we do, that yes, corporate registries have got their problems. Certainly there is questionable reliability in some areas, but they are the most legally authoritative source of that information. Companies are legally required to keep it up to date. So it's always a good place to start. It might not be the place to end, but it's a good place to start in terms of capturing a record from the registry, comparing that to whatever details that the business has submitted. And actually another good thing with that, and this is something we help with a lot, is that actually it can reduce the amount of information you actually need to collect from the prospective client as well. I work very closely with a number of law firms in the UK. You know, I think we're increasingly waking up to this challenge around business verification. And one of the common refrains I hear is, well, look, you know, we're having to go back to our clients 5, 6, 7 times to get different aspects of information. And a lot of that data they'll be requesting sits at the registry. Again, so if you've got a good pipe into that, then yeah, you can reduce what you need to collect. You can reduce the customer friction as well that happens there. I would say though that you know, in terms of top tips, widening the lens is really important, and that's looking at other data sources that you can use not only to corroborate the verification, but also when it comes to assessment and screening as well. And we're investing very heavily at the moment in things like that anomaly detection and bringing in other open sources to look at, well, actually, can we, you know, make a judgment call about, you know, what the company declares they do versus what they actually do. You know, is what they tell Companies House that they're working on, what's on their website. Mm-hmm. So I think it relies, you know, currently certainly on having skilled analysts that understand what those sources are and how to go through that process. But increasingly, and I'll say it's not just Kyckr doing this, there are real technology solutions coming onto the market that can take that from what has traditionally probably been a several days long process, possibly weeks if you're working on other cases, and quite seriously make it a seconds or minutes style process.
The point you made about too much data, my words, not yours, and making sure you're looking at the right. I go back to the parallels in my mind, the early days of sanctions detection. So in the United States, looking at the Office of Foreign Assets Control and the lists that they put out. I can remember in the early days, sort of even pre-internet, you get these lists, and for foreign entities, foreign names that weren't familiar in the U.S., if a letter was moved this way or that way, you would just miss all the data. So what's the challenges for, in your world, for foreign language descriptions of companies? So obviously the data's scrubbing is much better now than it was 20 years ago, but are there challenges there dealing with, again, not just foreign languages, but maybe the way entities are listed in countries, that that sort of thing?
Yeah, there are real challenges with that. I mean, you're dealing with different languages, you're dealing with different character sets, and actually just understanding the regulatory framework of the company, the country you're dealing with for whatever the company is you're onboarding, really, really challenging for most teams. We're working with banks that are working literally across 100 countries. So, it's a bit much to expect that one person's going to understand the rulings in every country.
Sure.
So I think that's where it helps, again, to have, an intermediary layer you can use to navigate some of that. And part of that is working with organizations that have that local knowledge. Kyckr, we're fortunate that we work with registries, we work with partners in each of those countries that have very, very specific knowledge about, what data is available. But also there are, again, technology solutions that you can use to act as that translation, that resolution layer in between. Now, you've got to be careful doing that, because what you absolutely don't want, to paraphrase your point, is false negatives and false positives. Right. But again, increasingly, there are search tools, Elasticsearch, AI can help as well to help with that resolution between what you're collecting from the customer and what might exist within that registry. And interestingly, and I will say this, because I think this often goes quite understood from our client base and from organizations we're working with, not understood, is that actually the search capabilities that exist at different registries can vary quite wildly as well. So, at the UK, to start with one example, you have Elasticsearch, which I've just mentioned, which means, you can spell Coca-Cola with 3 or 4 letters out of place and probably still get a response. You compare that with the New York State Registry, so the Secretary of State, and actually you need to have a partial string, and that needs to be accurate to get any kind of response.
Wow.
So that just illustrates the challenge, really, that it's partly knowing what you're dealing with from a data perspective, and then also having a technology layer that can help navigate some of that.
Given all of this, how frequently do clients typically do verification? So you're going to verify to get on board, obviously, and then, as you would normally, as the know your customer world, outside of verification, it's continually monitoring the activity of a company, at least transactionally, to see if there's anything that could be considered suspicious, or maybe you want to, the age-old issue used to be, doing this years ago, the pizza parlor is bringing in a ton of money on weekends, but there's nobody there and the pizza's not that good. So you figure that out. So in the data world, how frequent, or what's the recommended approach to, I won't call it re-verification, but is it when you add board members? Is it the company expand? Just give us a sense of some of that.
Yeah, so I think let's start on transaction monitoring. That is a really interesting area, and where there's some fascinating projects being done with AI at the moment. And I would say that is further ahead than verification.
Right.
The verification world, I think generally from processes, systems, all of that needs to catch up and can learn a lot from what's going on in transaction monitoring. But what I see and what we frequently see in our customers is there is a general acknowledgement that the how often it's currently done is too infrequent. So you'll get your 1, 3, 5 year for high, medium, low risk. We'll go back and we'll re-KYC the customer. We'll ask for all their incorporation documents, annual accounts again. And that there is lots written about, and FATF's written about it, that is too slow potentially, and that allows criminal behavior to slip through the cracks.
Right.
But also, again, if we focus on the customer experience, it's quite annoying every year being asked to for your details again and having to re-verify that information. So the challenge we are and other providers are frequently set is, well, how can we move to a more perpetual form of KYC? And actually, that's a common word you'll see in the industry, perpetual. I like to think about it more as event driven, which goes back to what you were saying.
Yeah.
So how can we, get into a situation where we are only doing a review when there is a change, and it needs to be a material change. So there's different ways of structuring that, and by no means do I think as an industry we're at the end solution yet, and there's lots of good work happening to try and build that. But what I can tell you about how we are working on that and what we're doing is building a system that will allow you to detect changes at the registry. So by comparing a master record with a new record from the registry on a periodic basis, we can then detect what the materiality of that change is, whether it's a new director, whether it's a new shareholder. And on instruction from our client, we can then choose to notify them if it is the case that it corresponds with their risk-based approach. So you're moving ideally from a system where, yes, it's high risk. We do a re-verification of all of this information every year, to that actually we've got an alerting system set up. And, hey, if it's a very, very kind of small change, or they filed their annual accounts, we're not interested in that. But yeah, if the business is acquired, or there's a change in the majority of the directors, yes, we want to know about that, and that will then trigger a re-KYC, which might be more often than annually, as the case may be.
Sure. Now that would make sense. I'll get you out of here on this, and really appreciate your time today, Steve. This has been very helpful. Where do you see us meaning the broad-based financial crime prevention community in this space of verification? Where do you see us in the next couple of years? And then also feel free to plug your podcasts. I know you guys have done a number of those, and white papers that are on your website that people can learn even more than what you've been able to describe today. So plug those, but also, again, your thoughts on where you see us going the next couple of years.
Thanks, John. Well, let's start on where we're going in the next couple of years. I think there is, largely thanks to actually the work of some of those journalists and others that we mentioned, there's going to be far greater exposure on some of the limitations and some of the problems with the existing company data world, particularly registries. We haven't really got onto the specific examples, but a simple Google search will pull you up stories every day about some of the fraudulent activity that's going on. So I think that is really coming to the fore now, particularly in the UK, particularly in Europe, and other countries. And what I would like to see, and I think what will happen, is better use of technology to be rooting that out earlier. And on the tech front, I think part of that as well will be, how can we get through a podcast with not mentioning the word AI? So I'll let me be the first one to mention it. I'm really interested by agentic workflows and actually using AI agents to pull in vast sources of data and compare them, very quickly. So I think we are entering a world, and we're working with some interesting startups in this space at the moment, that actually the initial verification interface is likely to become an AI agent. And actually that will pull in information from a registry, that will pull in your open source intelligence, that will pull in your adverse media, to build you a complete picture of the risk assessment of that entity. So I think there's some interesting stuff happening on that as well. We're certainly doing a lot on it. On both of those things, we've got our own plans, and I would say the best way to think about Kyckr for your listeners, consider us your registry experts. So when you're entering new countries, or when you are you're looking to onboard customers from a new country, there's plenty of resources we can offer. There's plenty of support we can give with aggregating that information. And the podcast you mentioned, this is for the nerdier, I think, of the listeners. But like I said, we deep dive each week into a different registry and really try and get to the bottom of, not just some of the data challenges, but some of the socio-political, cultural history that's maybe informed that framework. Why is it the Irish registry set up this way? Why does the Singaporean registry have such good verification? That's
perfect. I mean, that's exactly what people need to know, right? Is sort of the context, because knowing just what the registries provide, that's never enough, especially for the AML professional. I could say that we want more than that. We want to know the context, because we maybe get asked by the business lines of the institution, why are we doing this? As my words, not yours, why are we bugging our clients to give us more information? And if you know the context and you know the way these systems are set up, you can answer those questions, because that's an age-old issue in compliance. Is the compliance officer is always conceding, oh my God, they're going to want to spend more money doing regulatory response. And what I would argue is they're protecting both the shareholders, the clients, the institution from reputation and other damage. And so this is just another very important tool. Steve Lamb, so the website is Kyckr.com, Kyckr. The white papers, the guides, and the podcasts are available there. Thank you very, very much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.